Did you say something, Lee?
Yes,
Oh, I thought you said something. Did you?
I did. I did. We just went live.
Oh, you said live. Okay, great.
Yeah. So, welcome everyone out there who is watching right now. Um, we are here with Jackie Patterson from the NAACP. I'm Lee Haynes from PHM-USA. Um, and we're also here with Baj Mukhopadhyay from PHM Canada.
Hi everyone.
So we are from the People's Health Movement. Just a little bit about the People's Health Movement. We are a network of individuals and organizations and institutions who advocate for health as a human right in many different ways, and also kind of try to connect health to many different issues because through the social determinants of health. So we invited Jackie to talk with us about climate change and the health impacts of climate change and also climate justice. Um, so, Jackie, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be
Thanks for
here.
making time for us in the airport.
Yeah, all crazy.
So, Jackie, you are from the NAACP's Climate Justice Initiative, and I was on the website for the Climate Justice Initiative, and I was going to pull up what it says. Uh, some of the goals for your program are to reduce harmful emissions, including greenhouse gases, advance energy efficiency and clean energy, and improve community resilience and livability. Um, and I know that people probably think about those types of things when they think about climate change, but I don't think that people often think about justice when it comes to thinking about climate change. So I wanted you to talk about and maybe explain a little bit what is climate justice in the sense of climate change activism and the fight to kind of combat climate change.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you all, even from the airport. Hopefully, you'll be able to hear me okay. Um, yeah, so it's been interesting working in the program and working with the various communities as even our definition around. I mean, the definition of climate justice hasn't evolved as much as our approach to addressing it, which even as of late with the surge of the movement for Black Lives and so forth, it all remains intersectional. So we see climate justice as a as the fact that in communities of color and low-income communities in various populations like women, people with different health, special health needs, and so forth, are disproportionately impacted both by the drivers of climate change, like coal-fired power plants, like near roadway air pollution, like how we deal with waste in terms of burying it or burning it, um, etc. And we're also disproportionately impacted by the results of climate change. So whether it's shifts in agricultural yields when we're already living in food insecure communities, of course the disasters given our the fact that we tend to be underinsured, we're often living in coastal areas that are more impacted by storm surge from disasters, and that in various social, economic, and political ways we're less prepared to deal with the impacts of disaster. And then, of course, the sea level rise, where because again we're more likely to live in coastal areas, and also because of those other social, economic, and political factors. When questions come up in terms of preparing people for storm surge that results from sea level rise, then infrastructure decisions are differentially made depending on who you are in a community and who's in a decision making position and who's going to be impacted. And so all of those issues are disproportionately affecting certain communities and certain populations. So we really see these as civil rights and human rights issues. through our lens. Yeah.
And so, do you see, or I shouldn't say do you see, but when it comes to your work and talking about climate change from a justice perspective, how do you see kind of a justice approach differentiating itself from kind of a traditional kind of just let's stop the bad things that are happening with climate change approach?
So how do we see ourselves differentiating a justice approach from a? I didn't hear the very last part.
From just kind of from the more traditional, well, I should say, whenever I first started hearing about climate change and people talking about impacts of climate change, it was more the air is getting bad, the weather is getting bad, and it will kill you. And so, and so, I guess I'm asking the justice aspect. What kind of yeah, like what different aspect from a traditional approach, kind of the climate change will kill you
Yeah.
approach, does it? Do you think you see in your work?
Yes. So I'll give multiple examples. So starting with some of the drivers of climate change, I'm picking up my laptop so you can see me a little better. Starting with the drivers of climate change, even as we started to do our work around coal-fired power plants, we did a report called Cold-Blooded, Putting Profits Before People, and it was analyzing the toxic emissions from coal-fired power plants. And we looked at coal-fired power plants because they both affect the health and well-being of communities, whether it's because they are putting out sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, mercury, arsenic, lead, all these different toxins, in addition to being the number one contributor to carbon dioxide emissions. So whether so some environmental groups, when they are prioritizing their work to address pollution from coal plants, they might just do a straight list of which ones are emitting the most carbon dioxide emissions. Because that's what they're thinking about is climate change and what's going to prevent climate change. But we're looking at that as well as all these other pollutants that are coming out of these coal plants, as well as where they are located and who's being impacted today, every day, all day by these coal plants. And so when we put out cold-blooded, our target list and our prioritization and our plants that got ranked the worst are different from plants from a ranking from a group that's only going to care about carbon dioxide emissions. So the justice lens looks at how communities are impacted by coal plants now, as well as the lens of looking at carbon dioxide emissions and how they're going to impact us, otherwise.
Okay.
Another example is on the results side. Recently, not recently, in 2012, I was in Louisiana after the and the Plaquemines Parish had been completely devastated by Hurricane Isaac, and the levees had been completely breached and overtaken, just like they had after Katrina. And so Senator Mary Landrieu of Louisiana was on CNN, and they said to her, it's been 7 years since Katrina. There's been all this work that's been done to fortify the levees. Why were these levees compromised again? And she said she asked the Army Corps of Engineers the same question, and they responded that they prioritized which levees they're going to work on by using a formula where they assigned different points to different levees, and the ones that got the attention first were the ones that were protecting areas where there would be the highest economic impact. So, and it was total economic impact. So even if, let's say, that means that, if there's 500 shacks, with 2,000 people living there versus one high rise that's, high value high rise, the high, that levee that's protecting that high rise is going to be the one that's. So, we're really looking at those kind of equations. And so
Yeah.
we're looking at results of climate change and addressing those and building infrastructure and building resilience. We really need to be looking at it through an equity and justice lens. So those are just two examples. I could go on for the rest of the night on that question. Yeah.
So, Jackie,
But I
just to dwell on that theme a little bit more, I was wondering whether you could give us an example. I know here in Canada, mainstream environmentalist groups have struggled with dealing with equity issues, especially around race and class and gender. And I'm wondering, what have your relationships been with mainstream environmental groups in getting them to understand that their differentials along race, class, and gender are actually important and that they need to incorporate that sort of analysis into their work? In Canada, sometimes the relationship between mainstream environmental groups and groups working more on a justice lens, it's actually been hostile. Like people have been, arguing and fighting over resources to do movement work. What has been your approach to kind of dealing with those conflicts?
Yes, thank you. That's an excellent question. So, yeah, so our approach has been multifold. One, we actually worked with a couple of groups to do this session at a coal retirement conference, and the session was, we thought, not appropriately titled "Engaging Non-Traditional Groups in Fighting Coal Plants" or whatever. And so we were concerned, kind of about who they're defining as non-traditional and all of that. And so, but anyway, we held the session nonetheless, and from that there was a number of notes that came out, and I took that and turned it into a report called "And the People Shall Lead: Centralizing Frontline Community Leadership in the Struggle for a Sustainable Plan." I always put like half the content into the title. Anyway, but that report really like laid out all those kind of struggles, whether it's resource struggles, cultural struggles, all these different struggles in organizing together, and it laid out based on experiences of different groups those challenges, what the roots are of some of those challenges, and where folks can go in terms of being able to have better relations together. And so since then, from that, I've also worked with a number of groups on holding anti-oppression trainings, facilitated some of those, and also connected people with other resources for them to do anti-oppression training so that they can be more sensitized to these kind of, as you said, race, class, gender, and other isms in our society, be more self-aware, and really put together a plan for explicitly having an anti-oppression framework and how they operate. So that's, really what I've been advancing quite a bit since then. But so that kind of got right to what we're doing about it. I don't know if you want more examples of, yeah, but yeah. But some of
That's
the issues that we found, even around race, class, and gender, even as recently as tonight, I was talking to a couple of not to be named big green organizations, but about some of their framing around what they call population justice as it relates to climate change. And I was saying that I was at a meeting last week at Drexel University, and someone asked a question about what they called the elephant in the room in terms of population and climate change, and how we're really being kind of obtuse by not dealing with population in the context of climate change. And it reminded me of when I was in another meeting where someone kind of said a similar thing, like, I'm going to name it, I'm going to name the elephant in the room population. We need to be dealing with population. So just looking at that as from a gender perspective, I was saying to that person at that meeting back then that if you're really going to talk about population, you should really start with the United States, in terms of it being only 4% of the world's population, and at that point 30% of the emissions that drive climate change. So if we kind of knocked out the U.S. population, we'd all be in a better situation. So so that's those are some of the conversations we have. Yeah, so I could give more examples once again, but I will stop there. Yeah, so
So that was a really great question, Bosh. So just to kind of talk about some of the health impacts of climate change that you've seen, because I know that you go around the country a lot and talk to people and some of the struggles that they're having. So I wonder if you could give us a few examples of some of the health impacts that people are seeing, I guess, on people's health, and then also just living conditions and the sense of kind of social determinants of health. Um, and then, yeah, just from your own experience, and especially to kind of highlight disparities from community to community.
Sure. Yeah. So again, looking at it both from the driver's side and the impact side around climate change. On the driver's side, we talked about coal-fired power plants, and in the review that we did, we found that 68% of African Americans live within a 30-mile radius of a coal-fired power plant. 56% of the general population, so it's still pretty rough there. Um, and that um, the conditions that are tied to the various pollutants that come out of coal-fired power plants are more prevalent in African American communities because on top of the coal-fired power plants, African Americans, the communities are inundated with other types of pollutants as well. So they have this cumulative impact situation where it's not only the coal plant, but it's also the bus depot or the other types of near roadway air pollution or the incinerator or the cement kiln or whatever the industries are, the oil refineries that are in communities of color in general, African American communities, um, Latino communities, indigenous communities, and so forth. And so then when you look at some of the toxins, let's say from a coal-fired power plant, including sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, those are each tied to exacerbating asthma. And African American children in the Bronx, for example, are 5 times as likely to enter into the hospital from asthma attacks, and nationwide, 3 times African American children are 3 times more likely to enter into the hospital from an asthma attack and twice as likely to die from an asthma attack. And again, looking at adults, that African American males are less likely to smoke than white American males, but more likely to die of lung disease, which again is pretty much across the board tied to some type of external toxin. And so, and then like I said, with incinerators also have other toxins that come out, like carcinogens like benzene, or landfills that also pollute the air in terms of driving climate change with their methane emissions, and incinerators also with their methane emissions. But landfills, one of the groups that we worked with had where the landfill liner had eroded and trichloroethylene got into the water supply, which is a known carcinogen of the community, and a cancer cluster erupted as a result of that. Everyone who drank that water, each of the households, literally each and every household in that community drank water, some form of cancer, some very rare, and also a number of birth defects. So so again, the industries and practices that drive climate change are ones that are just damaging the health of communities of color and low-income communities. I'll also add that cradle to grave, the coal process is damaging. So a lot of people will say, "Oh, let's do carbon capture and sequestration because that'll take care of the carbon dioxide that goes out in the air." But then, what's that going to do for the 76,000 coal miners who have died of black lung disease since 1968 and their families? And so, again, that's on the driver's side. And I guess the other thing I'll also say is that living in that we really, probably, and not probably, no probably about it, we definitely do not take into account the mental health effects enough. We'll talk about those more on the result side of climate change, but even on the driver's side of living in a cancer cluster, and having either your family members or just living in a community where death is the norm, death and illness is the norm, where you're going to church and half the people are on respirators, and you're teaching in the schools and half the kids are carrying inhalers. I mean, those kind of things are erode the psychic energy of the community. And so that also is certainly something to be taken into account. And I've experienced too much where I'm talking about one great organizer or another who's won these victories or has fought these hard fights, and I'm talking about them in the past tense. I mean, too many of the actual human rights fighters are being taken taken by either the very illness that is coming from the polluting industry that they're referencing, or from just working from dawn till they collapse every day because it's such an overwhelming and such a heart touching situation that they're in when again these communities are under such siege. So yeah, so there's all of that. And then on the other side, in terms of the impacts of climate change, we talk about shifts in agricultural yields. Already our communities are in what they call food deserts, but a lot of communities don't like to be referenced as food deserts because deserts are a naturally occurring thing. And the fact that our communities are food insecure is often, back to redlining and then modern day discrimination in in housing and urban development and so forth, and rural development to that extent. So the food insecurity that already exists, where people are more likely to get their food out of a corner store, which high in preservatives and sodium and sugars and so forth, that literally have no nutritional value whatsoever. They just make you not hungry. And so, worst case scenario, best case scenario is no nutritional value, but on the other side, sodium, all that sodium and sugar is actually harmful to your health. And so, and the fact that that's only exacerbated now by the shift in agricultural yields, you're even less likely to be able to get affordable, nutritious foods, is certainly a challenge for our communities. And then when we talk about these disasters, uh, often because of our wealth differentials, we're more likely to have poor housing stock. So a disaster that might hit a home that's well built might, just, take off a few shingles or break a window or so, but it might actually just take down altogether a house that's not well built. And so the most vulnerable of us are more likely to be impacted in that sense. Um, One of our environmental and climate justice leaders lives in Gulfport, Mississippi, and she talked about having to evacuate from her home after Hurricane Katrina, and she had neighbors, her aunt, they all piled into a car and went to a neighboring area, and she ended up losing, like subsequent to that, just the stress of all of that, uprooting, people losing their homes, all that movement and uncertainty. A couple of her elderly relatives ended up dying subsequently just from the stress of it, not to mention the 1,800 people who actually died in the disaster itself. So, just all too many examples, but those are just a few. Thank you.
Jackie, I the one of the things you mentioned really intrigued me. One of the things we struggle with amongst PHM activists in Canada is how some communities who are experiencing environmental health problems, they might experience it in their day-to-day life. They have anecdotal evidence. They have stories, real-life stories of how they feel the environment has affected their life. But when it comes to getting hard data or getting scientists or the government to to understand their stories, they find it really hard to communicate because it doesn't necessarily show up in hard data. And that's the language scientists and governments speak in. They speak in hard data, not in stories, in lived experience. Have you developed any strategies for the communities you work with to get those stories to be translated into real action from the parts of the powers that be?
Yeah. So we've done a combination of things, and one is with the cold-blooded report as an example. We, we combined actually doing, generating data with adding in the stories, and we not only did that in the report itself, where every community that we highlighted included a number of stories and quotes from the community members to really highlight that these statistics aren't just numbers on a piece of paper, they're actually people who are having these experiences. And then we also did a video to accompany it as well to really kind of highlight those issues. And similarly, after the BP Oil disaster, we pulled the data, everything from number of new people experiencing unemployment to hospitalization rates um, to the police blotters, because after every disaster, speaking of gender again, there's a spike in domestic violence and a spike in sexual violence. And so we pulled all of that in terms of the data for the report, and then everything that where we were sharing data, we also share stories from interviews that we did. So we just couple the data with the real stories. And so that's one thing that we do. But we also in our toolkits that we do, and as we go in and we meet with communities and we leave recommendations afterwards, we always recommend and try to facilitate connections between communities and universities. And so, for example, the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice and Texas Southern University with Bob Bullard and Beverly Wright. They have coined this phrase, the communiversity, where the community and the university work together. So that's something we really encourage as well. We also have put out kind of guidance on doing citizen science, whether it was kind of like the bucket brigade type of thing, air monitors, and those kind of things. So we really give models so that people can do the data, but then again, always coupled with the stories. So that's kind of how we address that. Thank you.
So I wanted to ask, do you find, I guess, when the NAACP or when your group gets involved, do you find that it's a few people who kind of have made connections between the I guess the drivers of climate change and their health, and they kind of want to spread the word around the community to kind of mobilize their community, or is it the other way around where the activity is identified and then you might want to go in and see what the health impacts may be? I ask because I feel that often people just are trying to get by every day, and they may be sick and might not even be making the connections between these activities and their health. So, so I wonder kind of how you've seen the connection be made within communities, and how you kind of support that, in addition to kind of doing the communiversity and things like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So with the communities that we work with, it varies quite a bit. So when we did the cold-blooded tour, we basically first we started with the data. We looked at 378 coal-fired power plants, just basically ones that produced over 100 megawatts. Um, just in terms of the size of the plant, and then we looked at census data, so that we could determine the population density surrounding the plant, and then the percentage of people who are people of color, the percentage of people who are low income. And then we looked at EPA data in terms of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide emissions. And then we did an algorithm that tied all of that together, and we ranked the plants based on that. And then we went out to communities and we said, do you know about this? And so there are some communities who were like, yeah, I ride past that plant every day, but I never tied that to the fact that half the kids in my school are on asthma inhalers every day. And I never tied that to the fact that half the people in my church have COPD, or I never thought about that in relation to the fact one fellow, Mr. Hickerson, in New something, Indiana, and I just remember the name, but New Albany, Indiana. He said, I never tied that to the fact that we live 2 blocks away from this coal plant. My wife never smoked a day in her life, and she died of lung disease. And so in that same area, New Albany, we met with this woman who said, actually she had thought about the fact that her father died of lung disease. He worked in the coal plant, and he never smoked a day in his life. And so, so it varied in terms of whether individuals have thought about it and were, in relation to loss of family members, and the extent to which whole communities had thought about it and were actually taking action. But more than not, in the communities we met with, they were not engaging in action, with some exceptions, like the Little Village Environmental Organization. We went and visited community. They had been fighting for 10 years around that coal plant that was in there. Those two coal plants that were in their communities, and they were successful. 2 years ago, they announced retirement of those two coal plants, but they literally had been fighting for 10 years. And when we got to Hammond, Indiana, it wasn't so much that the community had decided that there was a challenge, but that the League of Conservation Voters, or League of Women Voters, one of those leagues, had started to organize, and they engaged the community on the coal plant, and the coal plant went offline. So so it varies quite a bit. So another in Dixon, Tennessee, in terms of the landfill that contaminated the water supply of that community, they didn't know. Like, they had been drinking that water for years. They had no idea. But this person had come home to take care of her father, who was terminally ill, and then subsequent to that, was Sheila Dixon was diagnosed with cancer. She was a bodybuilder, health fanatic, and she really just started to ask some questions, because she realized that, like I said before, every household in that community, mostly her family members, had some disease, or some form of cancer and other birth defects. And then she went and did some digging in the state records, and found out that several years before, some of the community members, basically the white community members on one side of town, had all received letters saying, "Don't drink the water anymore. This water is contaminated," and they were put on an alternate water supply. The animal shelter that was between the homes where her family homestead was, and the landfill, they were the animal shelter was put on an alternate water supply, while all of her family homes, they were drinking that water for years and years. And so she organized around that. They actually ended up working with legal counsel, and got a settlement over that, because the culpability was very clear in the records. So that's all to say, it just varies. Whether we have someone like that who's doing that investigation and unearths this connection, or whether it's like an organization, a green organization, environmental organization, that makes this tie and helps to organize folks, or otherwise. Yeah.
Thanks for that.
Sure.
And I guess when it comes to empowering communities, and empowering people in communities to engage with the local authorities, to actually make changes, what type of, I guess, strategies have you found that work? I mean, are sometimes the local people kind of resistant? They're like, well, I work there, that's my job. Or are people more, excited to kind of get engaged that way?
Yeah. So it's been interesting in that regard too, because that also varies. Because one of the communities where we started to work on the coal plant, the community leader, after being on the news talking about the release of the cold-blooded report, and he received a death threat. Um, and he kept on fighting, but like, those are the odds that people could be up against when there's that, like you said, economic dependence. Other communities, but for him, that was actually that made him dig in even more. He felt very even more empowered. Like, I must be on the right track if I've got this level of reaction. He's kind of this old guard civil rights kind of history. And then other places, like, let's say, Steubenville, Ohio, where like half the people in the town like work at the coal plant, and then the other half of the people rely on the revenue from the people who work at the coal plant, and then spend their money at the dry cleaner or the 7-Eleven or whatever. So there's not even really a conversation about trying to transition from coal, because the entire community is completely enmeshed in the coal industry. And so the best step in that situation is to begin to grow an alternate industry that, provides jobs and so forth. And then, you know, as society shifts, I mean, as a society, we're moving away from coal. As an economy, we're moving away from coal. So at least if one does that, then that community is more prepared for what will no longer be a choice for them, pretty soon. As with the Clean Power Plan regulations and so forth, it will no longer be as affordable to actually run our electricity system based on coal. So, so that's just an example. But so in some places it's about just kind of people not necessarily knowing how to speak truth to power, how to make that change. And so we put together tools like how to speak to your public utilities commissioner. Here's some examples of op-eds, how to influence the media. Here's an example of how you actually speak to a coal plant owner or an incinerator owner. Here's a script of the types of questions you might want to ask. Here's how you file an administrative complaint based on Title VI. So those are the kind of tools we're giving people to help them to be able to take the actions that they need, to make change in their community. And in addition to fighting against toxics, we really are building out like the alternative. So instead of just fighting to shut down an incinerator, we're actually actively working with communities on building recycling projects. Instead of just fighting against coal plants, we're actively working with communities on building energy efficiency projects, community-owned solar projects, etc. Instead of just talking about bus depots and pollution and so forth, we're actively working with communities on transportation equity models. And with the food, the scarcity in food and so forth, we're actively working with a number of communities to do community-owned local food movements. So in Longview, Texas, and Gulfport, Mississippi, doing community gardens. And so we're empowering people through like them building those alternatives and seeing the benefits to their communities in terms of job creation, revenue creation, and cleaner air, cleaner water, access to the public goods that are threatened by the system as it stands. Yeah.
So speaking of making the connection between kind of the government level and what's actually going on in the community, I think that it's sometimes it's simpler for people to make the connection between their like local authority and maybe even the state and what's going on in their community, but at the same time, I'm not sure. I think that that you all do work kind of on the international level too, with like the climate conference coming up in Paris and kind of world leaders wanting to work on limiting greenhouse gas emissions and things like that to combat climate change. Do you, in those situations or with those types of topics, do you find it difficult to kind of make the connection between this really kind of high-level global events and negotiations to what people are doing on the ground in their communities? And if you have worked around that, then how do you make people or help people understand that maybe this is also important for their kind of personal health?
Yeah, I hope I got all of that. But basically, making connections with
Global and the
with
local.
yeah. So like right, like UN talks and that kind of thing, and what's happening on the ground. Yeah. So we actually are actively right now as we prepare for COP21, the Conference of Parties 21 in Paris. We are about to roll out working with communities to do human rights tribunals, and so helping people to see the that that there is a human rights framework that's very little known or talked about, or certainly used in the United States, but that these various, whether it's contamination of the air, water, land, that these are all violations of human rights, and there's limits to our existing laws. Where the Clean Power Plan are the first ever regulations around these plans that for decades these coal miners were allowed to work underground, and there's been never any regulations for coal mine dust. That's why we've had 76,000 coal miners dying of black lung disease since 1968, while the industry fought actively against the types of laws that we need. So we talk about needing a higher law because our laws are insufficient as it stands, and that if we tie to a human rights framework, then we can actually use that as a measure as opposed to the limits of our existing laws and push for something higher. And so that's the kind of language we talk about, and then we concretely do things like a human rights tribunal, help people to connect with communities across the country who across the world who are experiencing similar dynamics. In South Africa, it's the same dynamic where coal plants and other oil refineries are disproportionately located in the black townships, just like they are in the black communities in the United States. So helping to connect our communities with those communities and see that they have common cause, and we can all kind of talk jointly about reducing harmful emissions, from our various standpoints. And so that's how we kind of frame it, making those connections, talking about a higher framework that makes the U.S. accountable to more than its limited policies that they have now. And so that's how we, that's how we do it. Um, yeah.
Okay, and so you mentioned kind of connecting across countries and across like different struggles. And a colleague, a PHM colleague from Ecuador, posted an interesting story. It was in Spanish. I didn't get to read the whole thing, but it made me think about the article was about the struggle of Indigenous communities for them to actually be able to kind of own the discussion and the conversation of the work they're doing in the indigenous lands in South America or in Ecuador, and they are being heavily repressed by the government, and it's very dangerous for them doing their environmental work. So I wonder if you have come across or you've heard stories of people who've come across any kind of repression from the state and their work, or other challenges that that are common or that you face, and also how you managed to overcome them.
So that I had a harder time. I mean, I heard the very last, but before, I didn't know which indigenous community you were talking about, in which country.
Ecuador.
Ecuador, okay.
But in Ecuador.
Ecuador, right. And so you were asking if there were similar stories to that situation where the indigenous communities are oppressed as they try to fight for their environmental rights. Other similar stories in other countries or in the United States, or
in your experience in the U.S.
So wherever.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Definitely. I mean, let's see. So some examples.
And I guess, I'm sorry, I'll also add, I asked just because we, at least I don't hear about it in the news that often. Environmental activists, being kind of shut down or quieted by the government or other groups. At least not now, maybe as much as 20 years ago or so. So that's one reason that I ask.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so some of the examples I would say, kind of think myself because so I guess one example is in France actually. We wanted to reach out in advance of the COP21 to the Roma groups, otherwise known as gypsies by some folks. But the Roma population, who are often the trash pickers, as they say, or people who deal with recycling and so forth, that there is, well, there's active, I mean, it's really extreme, the level of discrimination against the Roma people there. It's like the blatant and extreme discrimination is in an industrialized nation where usually, that type of oppression is just more systemic, as opposed to just out and out. I can't even describe it really, but it's very extreme, and so as they try to advance rights or even establish any level of dignity, it's actively repelled by the government there. Um, so that's certainly one example. Um, La Via Campesina, the landless movement. Um, I I know that, and I can't give specific examples. I think Brazil and some other places have been less than accommodating of the rights demands that they have made in different places. Um, yeah, and in the Philippines as well. I actually visited. They had a human rights tribunal for a few days in Washington D.C. I had first met some of the folks from the Philippines in Seattle, and then they came to Washington D.C. and did a human rights tribunal. And the level of abuses, while they were trying to fight for a number of human rights, state-sponsored abuses were pretty extreme from what they reported. So those are, and including environmental issues, but other issues as well. So those are just a few examples. Um, yeah.
And
Thanks.
what are the challenges within the North American context to do this work, do you think? What are the challenges to get people mobilized and organized? What do you think are the two or three most pressing barriers to getting people mobilized?
Um, I think one is uh, one is the challenge of the bully pulpit slash control that the fossil fuel industry has over our political system. So in some ways, if folks feel like, well, there's limits to it, no matter how much organizing they do, what policy advancements can we really see? And I again keep going back to the 76,000 coal miners who have died since 1968. I mean, the fact that the mining industry could hold such sway over our policies that it could be literally to the fatal ends of thousands of people, over a known time between coal mine dust and black lung disease. I mean, there's not like there's any question there, um, but yet it took 76,000 deaths before they were finally triumphant in passing that policy. So when you have that kind of circumstance where it's so clear and clear cut, and they still managed to wield that power, and when you have the Koch brothers putting $889 million into the 2016 election, it's daunting, I think, to people, and they wonder. So I think that that's probably one of the biggest things, feeling like disempowered by the way the system is set. Which is why I think campaign finance reform and getting money out of politics is a unifying campaign, that whether we're working, whatever era we're working in, that it you know so whether it's a food, you're working on food justice or energy or transportation or wherever you're working, if there's a that would be a good unifying campaign across sectors, across movements. Um, I think the other thing is that there has been a lack of intersectional analysis and framing and organizing. Like, people organize in silos, and given that people live such complex lives, then they become forced to make choices. But if we were better at doing intersectional organizing, then it wouldn't be, wouldn't have to, yeah, it wouldn't have to make you kind of prioritize one ill over another, individually or as a community. Um, So I think though that's again something that we're trying to grow in. I think in terms of these different movements, but it's taken a while to recognize that that's what we need to do. So I would say those are, you know, and then going back to your earlier question, just the culture clash between the groups that are working these issues. And when I say culture, organizing culture, like the modus operandi, like how people prioritize things. The fact that even a lot of these groups do just work on mono issues and fail to integrate. So if we have more environmental activism that explicitly integrated an economic justice lens, you would have more people on board. If you have more of a yeah, so I think that's another. Thank you.
Um, so as we have about 5 minutes left,
Yeah.
so I don't know if you had any final words or anything particularly you wanted to share, but I did want to ask, um, what, how do you recommend people who might not be active already in their communities, or who might want to start work in their communities, or who have noticed some health effects from drivers of climate change in their communities? How do you recommend that people start to get active? And I guess, how have you seen kind of smaller um, starting movements and work grow into work that's actually affected change?
Yeah. Thank you. So one thing that we put out, I think it was on Earth Day, we put out a document, 20 things you could do to advance a sustainable planet. And it kind of, intentionally gave all types of levels of engagement. So everything from the highest level being like running for office yourself so that we can start getting the right people into decision making places to, starting a community garden or, starting a small air monitoring project or working on river cleanup or doing a trying to advance a clean air ordinance in your community. Or so it has all those levels of engagement. I can send you the link to put up somewhere, but yeah, so it really kind of talks about small and big campaigns that folks can do, starting a local food movement, starting a recycling project, starting a community garden at the school, starting a green school, um, and then things that people could, and then doing like a screening of Years of Living Dangerously and having a community discussion. um, and we have a list of films that we put out for folks to consider. Those are always good conversation starters, and you get more people engaged. And then joining a local group. So if like you have a local environmental justice group, or even not even, but or a local branch of the NAACP, and whether they have an environmental and climate justice committee or not, that could be one thing that you could do, is actually start one if they don't already have one. So whatever group there already is, just joining and helping to take some leadership on this issue.
Um, that was a lot. Thank you.
Okay.
And I will post the link that you send in the event pages for this
Great.
hangout. Um, so, well, I just want to say thanks again for making time for us. It's been really great to have you for the hour. It went by really quickly.
Thanks very much, Jackie. We wish you
Yeah,
safe travels.
thank you very much. It's a pleasure. I look forward to hopefully working with you guys more in some other capacity. I mean, yeah, we should
Oh,
talk.
we have ideas. We'll be in touch.
Okay. I'm excited.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you, and
Thank you.
like Bosh said, safe travels.
Okay, thank you. Take it easy.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.